Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal. When the heavy front door slammed shut behind Rocco, an eerie stillness filled the room, broken only by the sharp echo of his footsteps across the hardwood floor. Lulu's heart began to pound erratically in her chest, a primal warning bell of an approaching storm she could no longer hold back. The silence stretched, but in Lulu's mind it fractured, disintegrating under the weight of all the lies she had spent years constructing and protecting. Never, not even in her worst nightmares, had she imagined this confrontation would come so suddenly, so violently, and from the very person she had dedicated her life to shielding. And yet, there he stood, her son, her once trusting little boy who now looked at her not with affection but with suspicion and a burning, righteous demand for truth. The name, Britt, hung in the air like a poisoned dart, slicing through the protective veil of carefully edited memories and constructed half-truths that Lulu had used to preserve the illusion of a perfect maternal bond. She froze, breath caught, as the realization sank in. This was the moment she had feared, the moment she had rehearsed for but hoped would never come. Rocco's eyes, once wide with innocence, now burned with urgency. They weren't just eyes anymore. They were instruments of interrogation, of justice, of pain. And Lulu, the mother who had once lulled him to sleep with whispered lullabies and stories about love and family, now stood exposed before him like a defendant under the harshest light. The memories came crashing in, uninvited and cruel. She remembered the day she first held Rocco in her arms, the day she swore to protect him from everything, including the truth. She remembered the anxious hours in hospital rooms, the legal proceedings, the DNA tests, and most of all, the quiet decision she made when she realized that motherhood didn't always begin in the womb but in the heart. But instead of drawing from these memories to offer honesty, Lulu reached for what she had always considered her only real shield, fabrication. Not out of malice, but out of desperation. She told herself it was for Rocco's sake. That knowing the truth would hurt him more than any lie could. And so, she crafted yet another tale, this time painting Britt as a dangerous figure from the past, a manipulative woman obsessed with control, who had sought to trap Dante through a child, who had no maternal instincts, no capacity for love, only schemes and shadows. Lulu's voice, though tremulous, took on a sharpness as she described Britt's supposed deceit, her instability, and the danger she once posed to the family. She spun a story of a woman who had tried to rip Rocco from their arms, who had endangered his future with her recklessness. In this retelling, Lulu was the savior, the protector, the only mother he had ever needed, the woman who stepped in when others failed, who fought to give him a name, a home, and a legacy. But the problem was, Rocco was no longer a child. And he had stopped believing in fairy tales. What Lulu didn't know, what she could never have predicted, was that Rocco had already uncovered fragments of the truth. His discovery wasn't accidental, but born from an unsettling curiosity that had taken root the moment he stumbled upon two conflicting birth certificates and a series of confidential hospital records in Brooke Lynn's disorganized files. He had spent sleepless nights poring over those documents, tracing the lines of typewritten words that carried more weight than any verbal confession. There it was, in cold, clinical ink. Britt's name, not as a medical supervisor, not as a surrogate, but as the biological mother. No amount of spin could erase that. The moment Rocco entered the house, he was no longer the obedient boy who took comfort in Lulu's reassurances. He had become a man determined to reclaim the truth of his own origin. He stood firm, his expression taut with restrained emotion, as he demanded answers, not later, not from Dante, but from Lulu herself. The woman who had raised him and, perhaps, deceived him all along. She reached instinctively for her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to call Dante, believing that perhaps together they could navigate the storm. But Rocco's voice, steady and commanding, stopped her cold. He didn't want reinforcements. He didn't want distractions. He wanted her, and only her, to look him in the eyes and tell him whether or not the woman he had begun to suspect, the woman called Britt, was, in fact, his mother. For the first time, Lulu felt truly alone. No amount of past love could soften the steel in Rocco's gaze. She recognized it, the same steel she had seen in Dante when he chased justice, the same resolve that had carried her through battles with enemies far more dangerous than the truth. But this wasn't an enemy she could outmaneuver. This was her son, and he had come to strip her mask away. In that moment, time seemed to bend around them. The room, once filled with warmth and laughter, became a courtroom. Rocco was the judge, the jury, and Lulu, the mother who had once been his entire world, was left to defend her version of reality. She had thought she could protect him from the pain, that her silence and creative truths were acts of love. But standing in the silence, under the crushing weight of his questions, she began to realize that perhaps the worst betrayal wasn't in the truth itself, but in her refusal to trust him with it. Still, she pressed on. She tried to reframe the story once more, insisting that yes, Britt had been involved in the pregnancy, but it was a complicated surrogacy agreement, riddled with legal and ethical chaos, and that Britt had voluntarily walked away. Lulu insisted she had been the one who nursed Rocco through colic, who bandaged his knees when he fell, who stayed up all night during his first fever. She begged him, with every word, to believe that biology didn't make a mother, love did. But for Rocco, it wasn't enough. Love, he now saw, had become a shield for secrets. And in that painful realization, something shifted. Lulu's desperation turned to anger, not at Rocco, but at the unraveling of the story she had so carefully preserved. Brooke Lynn would pay for exposing the files. Britt, even in her absence, would remain the villain in the narrative Lulu clung to. She convinced herself once again that her lies had purpose. That she was fighting for stability. That truth, if told too late, could be more destructive than the kindest lie. But what Lulu couldn't foresee was that Rocco had made up his mind. He would find Britt. He would hear the story from the only person who had been silenced for too long. And when that day came, no carefully crafted tale from Lulu would be enough to stop the reckoning that was already beginning to unfold. Backed into a corner and increasingly aware that her web of lies was unraveling, Lulu made one final, desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. She shifted her tone from defensive to nurturing, coding each word in the honeyed cadence of maternal concern as she began to construct a more elaborate and believable version of the truth. One that blended just enough reality with fiction to pass as plausible. She spun a tale in which Britt had, indeed, been a part of the complicated and ethically gray surrogacy arrangement that led to Rocco's birth. Lulu portrayed Britt not as a villainous figure seeking to reclaim a child she had borne, but as a woman who had, from the very beginning, relinquished all maternal claims and responsibilities. According to Lulu's revised narrative, Britt had agreed to carry the embryo purely for medical and logistical reasons, and once the birth was complete, she had stepped aside, disappearing from the child's life by choice. Lulu painted herself as the true mother in every sense that mattered. She recounted the long, sleepless nights in the neonatal unit, her arms cradling Rocco's fragile form as monitors beeped around them. She spoke of how she had been the first to hold him, to feed him, to watch over him with a vigilance that no one else had. She detailed the milestones, his first smile, his first steps, the first time he called her mom, moments she emphasized Britt had never been present for, moments she insisted could never be faked or replicated by someone who merely contributed biologically. In Lulu's version of events, she wasn't just Rocco's mother because she raised him. She was his mother because she chose him, every single day, through every fever, every heartbreak, every joy. But beneath this carefully tailored tale, there was a darker undercurrent, a quiet manipulation that Lulu slipped in with chilling precision. She told Rocco that Britt had a history of emotional instability, that she had once tried to manipulate Dante, that she had a tendency to create chaos wherever she went. Lulu suggested that Britt's sudden reappearance in Rocco's consciousness wasn't innocent, that perhaps someone had planted the idea in his head, or worse, that Britt herself was seeking to insert herself into his life for reasons that had nothing to do with love. She implied, without saying it outright, that Britt was dangerous. That she had always been dangerous. That trusting her could lead to nothing but heartbreak. It was a tactic Lulu had used before: reframe, redirect, instill doubt. And it had worked on others. But Rocco was no longer a little boy easily soothed by bedtime stories and whispered reassurances. He stood silently, absorbing every word, but his eyes told another story. They weren't soft with confusion or comforted by her presence. Instead, they were hard, searching, and almost unbearably still, like someone holding a photograph up to the light and realizing for the first time that something had been doctored. In that quiet, 100 memories began surfacing in Rocco's mind like fragments of a broken mirror. He recalled stumbling upon a dusty photo album hidden at the back of an old cabinet, filled with baby pictures that seemed oddly out of sequence. He remembered the way Brooke Lynn had hesitated when he asked her casual questions about his early childhood. How her smile faltered for just a second too long, how her hands tightened around her coffee cup as if she were holding back something she didn't have the right to share. He remembered asking Dante, during a father-son dinner months ago, whether he looked more like Lulu or someone else, and how his father had diverted the question with a clumsy joke and a sudden interest in the check. It had all seemed strange at the time, but not alarming. Not until now. Now, standing in the living room that once felt like the safest place in the world, Rocco felt as though the walls themselves had betrayed him. Each word Lulu spoke, however gentle, seemed only to confirm what he had begun to fear, that the foundation of his life had been built on something slippery and shifting, something designed not to protect but to obscure. The 2 birth certificates, the hospital record with Britt's name, the awkward silences, they were no longer coincidences. They were clues. And now, the pieces were finally falling into place. For the first time in his life, Rocco saw Lulu not as his unwavering protector, but as a woman driven by fear, desperation, and a need to control the narrative at any cost. He didn't lash out. He didn't accuse. He didn't cry. Instead, he simply looked at her, a long, lingering gaze that said more than any words could. In that moment, Lulu realized she had not just lost control of the story. She had lost her son's trust. And perhaps, somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that no amount of spinning could undo the damage now. Rocco was no longer seeking a mother's comfort. He was seeking the truth. And the truth, raw, unfiltered, and dangerous, was out there, waiting for him in the voice of the one woman Lulu had tried so hard to erase. Lulu knew, with every breath she took and every flicker of uncertainty that flashed across her son's face, that she had stepped into the very mire she had spent years shoveling layer by layer, believing it would hold strong beneath her feet. But now, that self-constructed terrain was giving way, crumbling into a pit of consequences she could no longer control. The harder she worked to conceal the truth, the more glaring the cracks became. Each evasive answer, each exaggerated detail, each forced smile only widened the chasm between herself and Rocco. And most damning of all, she knew that Dante's return would be the breaking point. He would see it in their son's eyes, the suspicion, the anger, the quiet storm of a boy betrayed. Dante had never been a man to lie well, especially not to Rocco, and Lulu feared that in the presence of that raw emotion, her carefully preserved version of events would dissolve like mist under the morning sun. That fear, like a corrosive acid, began to transform inside her. What had started as panic shifted into resentment, a cold, simmering fury that curled around her thoughts like smoke. It wasn't just the unraveling of her story that stung. It was the realization that she was no longer the sole author of Rocco's truth. Her anger first settled on Brooke Lynn, the unwitting saboteur who had exposed confidential documents and upended the fragile equilibrium Lulu had spent years constructing. Brooke Lynn hadn't intended to cause harm, but intent was irrelevant now. In Lulu's eyes, she was the one who lit the match. And as the fire spread, Britt's name resurfaced in Lulu's mind with renewed bitterness. That woman, long gone from their lives, had left behind more than DNA, she had left a presence, a ghost of a possibility that now threatened to undo everything. To Lulu, truth had never been an absolute. It was a tool, a resource, something to be curated and shaped by those with the resolve to wield it. In her worldview, it wasn't what happened that mattered most, it was who got to tell the story. And if she was no longer in control of that narrative, then her entire identity as a mother, protector, and anchor in Rocco's life stood at risk. With that chilling realization came the clarity of a woman on the brink, and she did what people often do when pushed into corners too tight to breathe. She plotted. Not rashly. Not with fury, but with precision. She began crafting a plan that would discredit Brooke Lynn subtly and thoroughly. She wouldn't attack her directly. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, she would whisper carefully planted seeds of doubt among those closest to Brooke Lynn. She would manipulate the context of the files, perhaps suggest that Brooke Lynn had misunderstood what she found, or worse, had misrepresented them out of jealousy, resentment, or simple recklessness. She would shape the narrative so that Brooke Lynn appeared meddling, intrusive, a woman with poor judgment who had destabilized a family with reckless curiosity. She would bend the facts just enough to warp perception, but not so far as to be dismissed outright. And to Rocco, she would feed these distortions slowly, not through outright denial, but through suggestion. A raised eyebrow. A sigh of regret. A statement like, people see what they want to see in old papers, especially when they don't know the full story. Yet what Lulu failed to realize, or perhaps underestimated entirely, was that Rocco had already started scripting his own path toward truth. Quietly, methodically, without spectacle or teenage defiance, he had made up his mind. No longer willing to be pacified by selective storytelling, no longer satisfied with half-truths delivered in trembling tones of love, he was determined to confront the mystery at its source. He wanted to meet Britt. He needed to see her not through Lulu's carefully tinted lens, but through his own eyes, on his own terms. He wanted to ask questions she might actually answer, and most importantly, he wanted to feel, in his gut, in his bones, whether the woman he'd been taught to fear truly deserved that reputation. Rocco no longer trusted anyone. Not Brooke Lynn, not Dante, and especially not Lulu. The people he had once looked to for guidance now seemed like actors in a well-rehearsed play, mouthing lines they didn't believe. The idea of maternal love, once a given, now felt conditional. Dependent on secrecy, loyalty, and silence. And with that realization came a cold, painful clarity: he would have to navigate this storm alone. And so, in secret, he began making inquiries. He found an old photo of Britt in a box of family relics and traced her past through online hospital records, social media remnants, and whispered mentions in old news archives. He wasn't looking for confirmation, he already had that. He was looking for connection, something visceral and undeniable that would either solidify or dissolve the fragile identity crisis blooming inside him. Lulu, meanwhile, remained oblivious to just how far Rocco had gone. She believed she still held the upper hand, still had the power to direct the tempo and flow of the unfolding crisis. But what she didn't know was that the true confrontation was already being arranged. Not by her, and not by Dante, but by Rocco himself. And when the moment finally came, when Rocco and Britt would meet face to face for the first time in years, the weight of everything that had been hidden, twisted, and weaponized would come crashing down. Not just on Lulu, but on the entire foundation she had fought so viciously to protect. The battle for truth, for love, for identity, wasn't over. In fact, it hadn't even truly begun. And when it did, it would not be won by those who spoke the loudest or lied the longest. It would be decided in the quiet spaces between questions and answers, between instinct and fact, between the aching need to belong and the raw pain of betrayal. For Lulu and Britt, the fight was never just for Rocco's love. It was for the right to be called mother. And only one of them would earn it in the end. And so, beneath the surface of every calculated word and strained embrace, a reckoning loomed, not just between Lulu and Britt, but within Rocco himself. The truth had never belonged to Lulu, no matter how carefully she crafted it, nor to Britt, no matter how long she had been erased from the picture. It belonged to Rocco now, a young man forged from the love, the lies, and the silence that shaped his childhood. And as he stood on the threshold of two conflicting worlds, one shaped by loyalty and control, the other by mystery and longing. He understood that the answers he sought could no longer be given, they had to be claimed. Lulu, in her desperation to preserve the version of motherhood she believed in, had lost sight of the child she had fought so fiercely to keep. Her fear of Britt, her need to rewrite the past, had blinded her to the growing autonomy of a son who no longer saw the world in black and white. And Britt, though absent, had never truly disappeared. Her name lived in Rocco's questions, her presence whispered through the cracks in Lulu's stories, and now, her truth waited patiently for its voice to be heard. What lay ahead was no simple reunion or confrontation, it was a quiet war of identity, memory, and trust. A war where the victor would not be the woman who loved Rocco most, but the one who dared to love him honestly. And as the lines between protector and deceiver, victim and villain began to blur, only one certainty remained. The moment Rocco met Britt, nothing would ever be the same again. In the end, truth does not shatter all at once, it seeps in, slow and relentless, until even the strongest walls collapse under its weight. And when they do, all that's left is what survives the ruin, love, if it's real. And trust, if it's still possible.